And what did you learn from working with Paul Newman?
He's a very honest man and a very generous man.
Before he took his final breath at the age of 89, Robert Redford, the living legend of Hollywood, shared a statement that deeply moved the entire film world. It was one of the rare moments when he spoke about his special friendship with Paul Newman, a colleague and soulmate who accompanied him for over half a century. When you speak of Hollywood legends, certain names carry a kind of gravity that transcends the screen. Robert Redford is one of them. Born in 1936 in Santa Monica, California, Redford came into the world not as the son of privilege or the heir to any cinematic dynasty, but as a boy from a working-class family who dreamed bigger than his circumstances allowed. His early years were shaded with hardship and rebellion. A restless student with a curiosity that stretched beyond the classroom, Redford first turned toward the arts almost by accident. Architecture fascinated him, and he briefly pursued it at the University of Colorado. But fate, in the form of an irrepressible passion for creativity, pulled him in a different direction, toward the stage. The decisive shift came when Redford enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York. There, surrounded by aspiring actors and the energy of Broadway, he began to shape his craft. It wasn't an immediate ascent to stardom. Like so many before him, he paid his dues through bit parts, auditions, and the uncertainty of an industry known to break more spirits than it elevates. Yet Redford's talent was undeniable. By the time Hollywood took notice, the groundwork for one of the most celebrated careers in American film had been laid. The 1960s and 1970s were the decades that defined Redford, not just as an actor, but as a cultural symbol. He embodied a new kind of leading man. Effortlessly handsome, yes, but with a subtle intelligence behind the eyes and a natural charisma that could switch from boyish charm to quiet intensity. His breakout role came in 1969's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where he starred opposite Paul Newman. The film wasn't merely a box office hit, it was a cultural phenomenon. Redford and Newman's chemistry turned the outlaw duo into cinematic mythology, and Redford into a household name. What followed was a string of landmark performances that solidified his place among Hollywood's elite. In The Sting, 1973, again alongside Newman, Redford helped craft one of the most stylish and beloved caper films of its era. 3 years later, he portrayed journalist Bob Woodward in All the President's Men, 1976, bringing to life the dogged pursuit of truth that unraveled the Watergate scandal. A performance that not only won acclaim but also underlined cinema's power to reflect and even influence history. Then came Out of Africa, 1985, where Redford's portrayal of Dennis Finch Hatton captured the romantic spirit of an era gone by, paired with Meryl Streep in a sweeping, unforgettable epic. Redford could have stopped there, content to be remembered as one of the most bankable and beloved actors of his generation. But his ambitions were larger than personal fame. In 1980, he stepped behind the camera to direct Ordinary People, a poignant family drama that revealed his sensitivity and intelligence as a storyteller. The film stunned Hollywood, earning him the Academy Award for Best Director. It was a turning point. Redford was no longer just an actor who happened to direct. He was a filmmaker of profound insight and vision. And yet, perhaps Redford's greatest legacy is not tied to a single performance or award, but to a movement he helped create. In 1981, recognizing the need for a platform that nurtured fresh voices in cinema, he founded the Sundance Institute. A few years later, the Sundance Film Festival was born. What began as a modest gathering in the mountains of Utah has since grown into the most important showcase for independent filmmaking in the United States. Careers have been launched there. Movements have taken shape. Directors who might otherwise have remained unseen, Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, and countless others, owe a debt to Redford's vision. The significance of Sundance cannot be overstated. At a time when Hollywood was increasingly driven by big budgets and safe bets, Redford carved out a sanctuary for risk, experimentation, and authenticity. He gave young artists the resources and confidence to tell their stories, even when those stories didn't fit into mainstream molds. In doing so, he reshaped the cinematic landscape, ensuring that American film remained as diverse and vital as the society it sought to reflect. For all his accomplishments on screen and behind the camera, Robert Redford has always resisted the easy lure of celebrity. While many of his peers embraced a life of public spectacle, Redford seemed to recoil from it. Fame, for him, was never the goal. It was simply the cost of doing what he loved. And behind that aura of quiet mystery lay a private life marked by both joy and heartbreak, a story far removed from the spotlight's glow. In 1958, long before he became the face of Hollywood glamour, Redford married Lola Van Wagenen, a young Mormon activist and historian. Their union was a partnership of intellect and spirit, grounded in values rather than vanity. Together, they raised 4 children: Scott, Shauna, David, and Amy. For a man who so often played the untouchable heartthrob, Redford's greatest role was as a father. Yet life, as it so often does, dealt him cruel blows. His first son, Scott, died in infancy in 1959, a tragedy that left an indelible scar. Years later, his son James Jamie Redford, a documentary filmmaker, passed away in 2020 after a long battle with liver disease. The weight of those losses never fully lifted. Redford carried them quietly, seldom speaking of his grief, but those who knew him often remarked on the depth of compassion and sensitivity that loss had etched into his character. Family, however, was never far from the heart of his work. Redford has often said that the themes of brokenness and reconciliation in ordinary people drew heavily from his own experiences as a husband and father. His films, subtle as they are, carry whispers of his private life, unspoken testaments to the challenges of holding a family together in a world that demands constant attention. Through every role, every project, one could sense that Redford was not simply chasing artistic triumphs. He was working through the complexities of love, parenthood, and the fragile bonds that define human connection. Redford's marriage to Van Wagenen lasted nearly 3 decades before ending in divorce in 1985. It was a quiet separation, handled without spectacle, a testament to both their respect for each other and their desire to shield their children from public scrutiny. For many years afterward, Redford remained single, focusing on his craft and his responsibilities as a father. Yet even icons deserve a second chance at happiness. That chance arrived in the form of Sibylle Zagars, a German-born painter and multimedia artist. Their relationship began in the mid-1990s, a meeting of 2 creative spirits who shared a reverence for nature, art, and spiritual exploration. Unlike the Hollywood starlets with whom Redford was often, sometimes unfairly, linked in gossip columns, Zagars carved out her own space as an independent artist, uninterested in celebrity. Together, they built a life centered on shared passions rather than public display. After more than a decade together, they married in 2009 in Hamburg, Germany, in a ceremony that was intimate, understated, and deeply personal. In many ways, Zagars represented the life Redford had been striving toward for decades, one of simplicity, authenticity, and creativity. The couple settled in Sundance, Utah, surrounded by mountains and silence. There, away from Hollywood's noise, Redford could embrace the outdoors he loved so dearly: fishing, hiking, and painting in solitude. Those who visited him often described a man who was most at ease not on the red carpet but in the wilderness, with a brush in his hand, or the crisp mountain air filling his lungs. Despite his fame, Redford has always maintained a philosophy of restraint. He rarely gave personal interviews, and when he did, he offered little more than polite reflections. He despised gossip culture, resisted the cult of celebrity, and often retreated from the spotlight altogether. In a world where exposure is currency, Redford's greatest act of rebellion may have been his insistence on privacy. He once remarked that mystery is essential for an actor, that if audiences know too much about you, they can no longer believe in the characters you portray. That belief shaped the way he lived his life, deliberately, quietly, and with a protective wall around the things he cherished most. Yet the paradox of Redford is that his silence only deepened the fascination. To the public, he was the elusive star, charming, magnetic, but always slightly out of reach. To his family and those closest to him, he was simply Bob, a father, husband, and friend who treasured intimacy over grandeur. His children, though raised in the orbit of Hollywood, often spoke of him as a man who encouraged independence and curiosity rather than conformity to fame. On September 16, 2025, as the mountains of Utah were still cloaked in the calm of early morning, Robert Redford passed away at his beloved Sundance home. He was 89. The news came softly, almost in the same way he had lived, without spectacle, without drama, as though life itself had simply exhaled one final time. He died in his sleep, surrounded by family, at peace in the sanctuary he had built over a lifetime. For many, the timing and manner of his departure seemed almost poetic. Redford had always sought refuge in the natural world, in quiet corners far from Hollywood's glare. Sundance was more than just a home. It was his vision made tangible, a landscape where art and nature coexisted, where young filmmakers could dream without compromise. That he chose this place as both his creative haven and his final resting ground feels less like coincidence and more like destiny fulfilled. The world awoke to the loss with a sense of disbelief. How could Robert Redford, an actor whose face had graced decades of cinema, whose presence had come to symbolize an era of integrity and artistry, suddenly be gone? Yet perhaps sudden is not the right word. At 89, he had lived a life fuller than most could ever imagine. Still, the silence he left behind reverberated across screens, newspapers, and hearts worldwide. It felt as though a great oak had fallen, leaving an open space where once there was strength and shade. Almost immediately, tributes began to flow. From actors who had shared the screen with him, to directors he had mentored, to activists who had marched alongside him for environmental and social causes. Each remembered him not only for the legend he was, but for the man beneath the myth. He was called a mentor, a visionary, a friend. Paul Newman, his most famous on-screen partner, had long since gone, but their names were uttered together once more, as though reunited in memory. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the eternal outlaws, now riding side by side in cinematic immortality. For his family, the grief was more intimate. Redford's life had been punctuated by loss. Children he had buried, moments of sorrow carried in silence. Those who knew him best understood that the very gravity he brought to his roles was born of this quiet suffering. Now, in his passing, his children and grandchildren gathered in Sundance not only to mourn, but also to celebrate a man who had given them the gift of love, resilience, and an unshakable moral compass. What made his death resonate so deeply was not just the star that he had been, but the paradox he embodied. Robert Redford was both an icon and an anti-icon. He was impossibly handsome, yet he shied away from vanity. He was a box office draw, yet suspicious of Hollywood's machinery. He was adored worldwide, yet happiest when alone with a fishing rod in hand or a paintbrush resting on canvas. His death, quiet and natural, mirrored the very qualities that had defined him in life. Restraint, grace, authenticity. News outlets framed his passing as the end of an era. But perhaps it is more accurate to call it a transition. Redford had always insisted that the real measure of a life lay not in celebrity or accolades, but in what one leaves behind. By that standard, his legacy remains vibrant, alive, and untouchable. The films endure, classics that will continue to be discovered by new generations. The Sundance Institute thrives, still giving voice to storytellers who might otherwise remain unheard, and the environmental causes he championed live on, strengthened by his early, unwavering advocacy. In the days following his death, theaters across America revived screenings of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, and All the President's Men. Audiences filled the seats not just to revisit his performances, but to remember how his films made them feel. Inspired, entertained, challenged. In living rooms, families rewatched Out of Africa, marveling at his timeless charisma. Online, young filmmakers shared stories of how Sundance had given them their first chance, their first belief that their voices mattered. Robert Redford's passing may have closed the curtain on a singular life, but it did not dim the light he cast. If anything, it illuminated more clearly the contours of his journey. The boy from Santa Monica who became a Hollywood star, the actor who turned into a director, the director who became a cultural architect, and finally, the man who built a life of meaning in the quiet shadow of the mountains, leaving this world with the same grace that he brought to every role. In the hush of Sundance, where the aspens tremble with the wind and the night sky stretches endlessly, Robert Redford's spirit lingers, not as a star fading, but as a presence woven into the fabric of cinema, of art, of nature. His death, like his life, is not an ending, but part of a story still unfolding. A story of courage, vision, and the simple power of living true. In the final months of his life, Robert Redford offered a rare and deeply personal reflection, one that surprised even those who had known him for decades. At 89, the actor, director, and visionary finally spoke openly about Paul Newman, the man who had shaped not only his career, but his very sense of what friendship in Hollywood could mean. It was a confession long withheld, delivered with the weight of a life nearing its close, tender, grateful, and profoundly human. Paul was someone who made everyone around him better, Redford said, his voice measured yet full of warmth. He was famous, yes, but he was also humble, kind, and endlessly generous. For those who had followed their story on screen, from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to The Sting, the acknowledgement felt like a closing circle, a final tribute from one half of a legendary duo to the other. Their relationship was the stuff of Hollywood mythology. On screen, they seemed almost inseparable, the perfect combination of charm and cunning, charisma and wit. Yet behind the lens, their connection was equally remarkable. Redford often described their bond as an unspoken rhythm, a blend of rivalry and support that elevated both men. They competed, yes, but in the healthiest sense, pushing each other to dig deeper, to risk more, to expand the boundaries of what a performance could achieve. That balance of challenge and camaraderie was the secret ingredient behind their film's enduring magic. Newman, who had already established himself as one of the era's great actors when he first met Redford, could easily have overshadowed the younger man. But instead, he extended a hand. He treated Redford not as a rival, but as an equal, and that generosity left a mark that Redford never forgot. He was like an older brother, Redford recalled. He had this way of offering advice without making it feel like instruction. Just when I needed it most, Paul would say something simple, something direct, and it would stay with me for years. Off-screen, their friendship was far less glamorous than the tabloids might have imagined. There were no extravagant displays, no staged photographs to satisfy the press. What bound them was something quieter, long conversations, shared laughter, and a mutual understanding that fame was fleeting, but integrity was eternal. Redford often joined Newman in his philanthropic efforts, watching in admiration as his friend poured his fortune into charities and causes, never seeking recognition in return. The lesson Newman imparted most clearly, according to Redford, was that success is not measured in accolades or wealth, but in how one uses influence to uplift others. Paul taught me that true success comes from kindness, from integrity, from the positive impact you leave on other people, Redford confessed. It was a philosophy that resonated with Redford's own journey. The same values that inspired him to create the Sundance Institute, to champion independent voices, to live not for himself, but for the stories he believed deserved to be told. What makes this late-life reflection so moving is its timing. Redford had spent most of his career fiercely private, reluctant to reveal his emotions beyond the boundaries of his art. He resisted nostalgia, avoided public sentimentality, and rarely spoke of personal relationships in detail. For him to break that silence at 89, to offer the world a glimpse of how deeply Newman had influenced him, was nothing less than a final act of intimacy with his audience. For fans, it was also a gift. It reminded us that beneath the glamour of Hollywood legends are men who shaped each other in ways unseen, who carried bonds that transcended fame. The Redford-Newman partnership was not just cinematic. It was a model of respect, humility, and the kind of friendship that endures long after the cameras stop rolling. In many ways, this tribute was not only about Newman, but also about Redford himself. By honoring his friend, He revealed his own values, his own measure of what truly mattered. He showed that even at the twilight of his life, he was still learning, still reflecting, still carrying forward the lessons of those who had walked beside him. And so, as the world mourned Redford's passing, his words about Newman took on an almost prophetic weight. They were not just a eulogy for his friend, but a mirror of his own legacy. Like Newman, Redford will be remembered not just for his artistry, but for his humility, his generosity, and his belief that cinema, and life itself, should be in service of something greater. Robert Redford has left us, but his spirit lingers in the frames of film, in the ideals he defended, and in the quiet strength of the friendships he nurtured. His journey from a working-class boy in California to an international symbol of cinematic excellence is more than a story of stardom. It is a testament to discipline, vision, and the courage to remain true to oneself. The tale of his lifelong bond with Paul Newman reminds us that some connections transcend even the greatest achievements. Together, they embodied not only a golden era of Hollywood, but also the deeper truth that artistry flourishes best when rooted in trust, humility, and respect. Their friendship was not a product of headlines or studios. It was authentic, human, and enduring. In honoring Newman at the twilight of his own life, Redford offered the world a final glimpse into the values that defined him: loyalty, kindness, and the belief that success is hollow without integrity. Now, as we look back on his remarkable 89 years, we are invited to carry forward what he stood for: to love the craft, to respect the planet, to nurture young talent, and to remember that even the brightest stars shine because they illuminate others, not themselves. Redford's legacy is not confined to the cinema screen. It is alive in every independent filmmaker chasing a dream, in every activist fighting for the environment, and in every individual who believes that art can change the way we see the world. And this is where you, the audience, become part of the story. If Robert Redford's films have touched your heart, if Paul Newman's friendship with him has inspired you, or if their timeless partnership has reminded you of the beauty of loyalty, then share your voice. Leave a message of tribute below, not just as a farewell to a legend, but as a celebration of all that he represented. By honoring his memory together, we ensure that Robert Redford's light continues to burn brightly in the collective imagination. His films will be watched for generations, but it is our responsibility to keep the conversation alive, to pass on the stories, and to keep learning from the lessons he left behind. So, if you too admire Robert Redford and Paul Newman, take a moment to write a heartfelt note in the comments. Let this space become a living tribute, where admirers from around the world can gather to remember. And don't forget to press like and subscribe to our channel, because through your support, we can continue to share stories of legends like Redford, Newman, and countless others who remind us that cinema is not just entertainment, but a reflection of who we are and what we value. The curtain has fallen, but the applause continues. Robert Redford may have taken his final bow, yet the echoes of his artistry, his friendships, and his humanity will never fade.